Hello, kiddies. This is the Crypt Keeper, and you're listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Be careful what you ask for. You may get it.
A Demonic Experience by Damon. This took place back between 2009 and 2010. I can't be more specific on time as it was a really messed up time for me then. And here's some context that I think is important. This is the Albertville Boaz area in Alabama, where I'm not originally from. This awesome guy, let's call him Gorge, and his family had taken in my young 18 male stupid self. Gorge, along with his wife, call her Kathy, had a group they would go on paranormal investigations with, that I joined, having been interested in that subject from a young age. Gorge had a stepson, and I'll call him Jim, who was my age, and we became great friends. Kelly had a paper route that on some Fridays and Saturdays, Jim and I would do for her. So late one Friday night, me and Jim had decided to do the paper route since we had no investigations with the group planned that weekend. We left the house probably around 10:30 or 11 p.m., went to Sardi's to pick up the papers and start the route. It started in Boaz and went through many back roads and then ended in Albertville. We were jamming out to music, cruising, and just having an awesome time. When we got to this one area on the back road straddling Boaz and Albertville, it was super dark, and now it was roughly 1:15 or 1:30 in the morning. We had to turn down this gravel road that ended in a cul-de-sac where we had to deliver some of the papers. We turned down the music and then headed down this road and spotted the houses. Back behind the houses was nothing but thick woods, and as we were putting the last of the papers in the mailboxes, we heard this guttural shriek coming from the woods. We looked at each other, and Jim asked if I heard that too. I confirmed I did, but before I could say any more, we heard it again. Closer, like it was at the edge of the woods just 100 yards behind us. Jim decided we're done here, and we're leaving. And just as he got up to roughly 20 miles an hour, we heard that damn shriek again behind us. I looked over to Jim, and he was looking at what I thought was me, completely ashen-faced. It took only a second before I realized he was actually looking out the window beside me. And I turned and saw it. It was dark, darker than dark, and I could see its silhouette against the surrounding night. The only lights were the car's headlights. And this thing looked similar to a large bobcat, but as if someone had draped a tattered cloth over it. There were no legs to be seen, but it was obviously moving quickly. It came up alongside the car, never looking at us. It stayed there for several seconds. We came to a stop sign as the gravel road tees out onto the paved road ahead. Jim slowed down, and the thing pulled ahead just slightly. As we got to the stop sign, it moved quickly forward, somehow jumping up over the stop sign. But as it did so, its cat-like head turned towards us, and we saw one large burning red-orange eye. It never touched the ground again. As we came to a stop, it shot off to our right, letting out the shriek one last time. Luckily, our route continued on the left. We were obviously freaked out and finished the rest of the route in record time, getting back home around 3 a.m. when ordinarily we would get home sometime between 6 or 7. We had decided that we were going to wake Gorge up and tell him what we had seen. But when we pulled in, Gorge was already on the porch, like he was waiting for us. He looked like he was about to tell us something, but the looks on our faces made him pause, and he asked us what was wrong. We told him, and then he started questioning us about what time specifically we saw the thing, where we were exactly, that kind of stuff. After about 20 or 30 minutes of conversation, he looked at Jim and said, "Well, I'm sorry to say this, but Rick hung himself on Lisa's porch earlier this morning." And that's not their real names either. Rick and Lisa were two members of the paranormal investigation group that I hadn't met. They had left the group about a year or so before I joined. It seems that during their time with the group, they had dabbled in demonology and gotten themselves in quite a predicament. This was told to me months before I was introduced to the group and told why certain topics and studies were taboo with them. Without going into too much detail, as I don't know much, Rick and Lisa had dabbled in dark stuff, messed with demonic entities, and even gotten possessed. Though most of that was eventually fixed, their relationship didn't last through it. Well, it seems that during our route, Rick had gone over to Lisa's and was trying to get her to take him back. He was apparently out of it, like he was drunk or high, but strangely, according to Lisa, coherent at times. After about an hour of him refusing to leave and making a nuisance out of himself, Lisa called the cops. She told him that he should leave, but she said he just got real quiet. Then she heard some shuffling on the porch, and then nothing else. She thought he'd left. This was around 1 a.m., and the cops got there around 1:30, and Lisa, seeing the lights, opened the door and saw Rick hanging from the porch roof beams with his belt around his neck. Lisa's house was along that same road the gravel road tees out onto, roughly 2 miles away. If we had turned right, it was the same direction that that demonic cat thing had gone when it left us. George guessed that Rick had never truly stopped messing with the dark stuff, and that what we had the misfortune of seeing was something coming to collect what Rick owed when he passed. The Channeling by Pope of Manwich. I swear, this is a true story. When our son was 4 years old, we went to my in-laws to have lunch and decorate Easter eggs. Grandma was there, but Grandpa was going to join us later after his car club event. We got to their house, and after lunch, while we were setting everything up for the eggs, our son was wandering around the house looking at all of Grandma's knickknacks, including her collection of miniature penguins, her trilobite fossils, and her collection of small music boxes. We told her to kid-proof anything she didn't want him grabbing, but she didn't care. She was so kind, fun, and chill. It was time to do the eggs, and I yelled for my son to join us in the dining room, but he didn't come right away. I decided to go find him, so I walked down the hall, and as I approached the den, I could hear him talking, like he was having a conversation with someone. I assumed he was talking to Grandpa, who probably had just returned from his car club meeting. But as I walked in the room, he abruptly stopped talking, and I saw that he was totally alone in the room, standing there, holding a little music box in his hands. It was weird, but I didn't think too much else about it. I just told him to put the music box back where he found it, but he said he wanted to play it for Shamma. Shamma is what he calls his grandma. We got to the dining room table and he sat down, and before anyone could say anything, he just said to no one in particular, "Susie says she's sorry and she's doing okay." My mother-in-law gasped, dropped some spoons on the floor, and immediately started crying. My then-wife looked like she was about to faint from shock, and I felt the hair on my neck stand straight up. My son continued. She says that she feels fine and to not worry about her. Susie was Grandma's sister, my wife's aunt. She drank herself to death about a year before my son was born, and because of the circumstances of her death and the sadness, shame, and resentment the family felt about how it ended with her, alienated from everyone after years of trying to help someone that didn't want help, they had never really talked about her. And just like that, my son started painting eggs and didn't say another word about Susie again. My mother-in-law, who was a very spiritual and new agey kind of gal, walked over, picked him up, and gave him a big hug. Then she looked down and saw the music box sitting on the table. My son looked up at her and said, "Shamma, Susie gave me that." El Paso High School Ghost by The Demon's Den. I graduated from EPHS in 2011 and only went back when my little brother graduated. What I saw and experienced at that school made me never want to return. For reference, the school is very, very old. It was built in 1916 and was even used as a makeshift morgue for those affected by the Spanish flu outbreak. The morgue was in the basement of the building under the theater classroom, and the basement was mostly closed off with the exception of the boiler room and the storage room. There were also these long pathways with short ceilings that lead to closed-off rooms. And one of those rooms is a perfectly preserved classroom that was abandoned, and no one knows why. If you could get a light through, you could see notebooks, lunchboxes, pencils, just all on the desks. It was like everyone just got up and left. With all that negative energy, it's bound to bubble up, and it did. Teachers and faculty would tell stories of feeling cold and seeing things they weren't sure were there. It sounded like a load of BS at first, but the school has photographic evidence of its ghosts. There's stories of suicide, tragic accidents, and even people using a Ouija board in the basement. I saw something one day that made me believe it all. I was a theater kid back then. I used to get all kinds of crap for not being in football because I was a 6'7" juggernaut, but whatever. The theater is where I like to be. When I was a senior, I had a lot of free classes, so I spent most of my time in the theater or the theater classroom. Hell, I even ate lunch on stage most days. Sometimes I had a few friends join me, but I was alone a lot of the time. Mostly by choice. One day at lunch, I went into the theater, turned on the lights, and pulled out my mangled lunch from my backpack and started eating. I didn't have mobile data at the time, and I didn't know what the school Wi-Fi password was, so I was just listening to music on my iPod Touch. As soon as the song ended, I heard a loud crash above me that sounded like someone fell over with a box full of silverware. I looked up at the catwalk of the theater, and I saw someone looking down at me. I didn't know who they were, so I waved and asked if they were okay. There was no response. I stood up and asked louder, but still, there was no response. The person looked like they were right on the edge of the catwalk, too, like their torso was fully visible. They were wearing a dress that looked like something you'd wear to prom in the 80s. It was like poofy. I took a breath and started to ask again, but what happened made me sprint out of the theater. The person faded into nothing, like they had just become less and less visible until they weren't there anymore. A cold sweat hit me. My armpits just felt wet and I farted. I grabbed my backpack and ran my giant ass out of that theater. I tried telling my friends what had happened, but they just laughed and told me to shut up. I only ever went back into that theater when someone was with me, and even then, I had chills and always felt like I was being watched. The Thing by Kumquat Velociraptor. My story takes place in the depth of winter. We get nasty cold snaps where the cold air from the mountain pools in the valley and gets trapped. It gets foggy and icy cold with not much change from day to night. On the night in question, it was probably close to -20 Fahrenheit. No wind, foggy, like being in a deep freeze, but visibility was 1/4 of a mile or so. I've had insomnia since I was a child, so it's not uncommon for me to wake up in the middle of the night and just be awake. I'm used to it, and just try to roll with it and sleep when I get tired again. That night I was lying in bed, awake, thinking about maybe playing a game or two on my phone, when there was this awful din. All the dogs in the neighborhood, and for miles around it seemed, were barking and howling, whining, yipping, and carrying on. We get our share of chain barking, but this was different. It was a fear or warning barking, the sound dogs make when there's a threat that scares them, but they need to try and warn everyone. I looked at my phone. It was close to 3 a.m., and all these dogs were barking their heads off. It went on for 30 seconds or so, and I realized that my 3 cats were in the room, and they were all growling and puffed up, staring at the big window in the addition section of the bedroom. The light from the church was on, and that was what was illuminating the room. The blinds were closed, but it was still a good strong glow, and I was wondering what had the animals all riled up. Maybe a coyote or a mountain lion? The dogs don't go nuts over deer, they're used to them. This deep into the winter, a predator wouldn't be out of question, and if it was something like that, I was thinking I might have to call wildlife control. So I got out of bed and headed to the big picture window that faced out onto the backyard. There were a lot of boxes and bins stacked neatly along the wall under it, so I could only get to the very left side of the window. The cats were all arranged on the boxes looking out the window, growling and their fur puffed. I peeked through the blinds and looked out over the yard and into the parking lot. There was something in the parking lot. Something weird. Not a mountain lion, and definitely not a coyote. It was big and shaped funny. My first thought is a newfie with wolfhound legs. My second thought was a dire wolf, but those are extinct. I looked closer. A big body covered in shaggy white fur and long, awkward legs that seemed jointed incorrectly for a canine or a big cat. It had paws, sort of, and they looked funny too. They were too big and lumpy to be paws. This thing had hunched shoulders and a weird round head without much of a snout, and it was all covered in lots of shaggy, thick white fur. It sort of looked like an emaciated polar bear. That thought made me realize how big the thing was. There was a dumpster next to the corner of the church, and this thing was standing a couple of yards away from it, and it seemed to be the same height, on all fours. It was just standing there, in the middle of an icy parking lot, facing north. It wasn't sniffing or moving or looking around like a normal animal would. It was just there. The dogs were all still going nuts and my cats were growling louder. But at that moment, I wasn't really scared or anything. Just really curious. I was wondering, what the heck is this thing? It wasn't a prey animal, I know that without a doubt. Not a deer or an elk or a moose or even an errant cow. It was a predator of some kind. But what? A weird-ass albino bear? A dire wolf on stilts? Some bizarre breed of dog I'd never seen before? I couldn't see it super clearly because of the fence, and I thought to myself that I could get a better look if I went into the kitchen and opened the back door. The only window that looks into the backyard is that one, so I actually had to physically open the kitchen door to see out into the yard. I stepped away from the window to go and do that, when it suddenly hit me that I did not want to open my back door, and not just because it was -20 out. I had a sudden moment of panic that I didn't want to take the chance of one of my cats shooting out the door, because I knew that that thing would kill any animal it came across, and I didn't want that animal to be any of my cats, and I super duper didn't want that animal to be me. I peeked out the window again to see the creature turn around and head towards the driveway that is the only way in or out of the parking lot. The movement was creepy and unnatural. I mean, the legs were all wrong, all angles and too long and moving in ways that didn't seem possible. It was moving slow, almost reluctantly, like it didn't want to be heading back to the street, but something was making it. Like it was a dog, and its owner wanted it to finish whatever it was doing and then come along. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was a dog. Someone was walking a weird hybrid wolf-bear monster in frigid temps at 3 a.m. Yeah, that's the ticket. It disappeared down the driveway, and the cats all stopped growling, looked at me, and then began fiercely grooming. You know the kind. The I was absolutely not just doing undignified things grooming. The freaked-out barking stopped cold, like it had never been. Usually we'd have a few stragglers that didn't get the hint that bark time was over, but not this time. There was nothing but deep winter silence. I petted the cats and then went back to bed. I lay there and thought about what that thing could have been. I know that it crossed the street and went into the high school parking lot without any of the motion sensors activating, and that it was headed towards the canyon that leads southwest out of the valley. The canyon with the highway we won't take, even though it cuts 20 minutes off travel time, because it just always feels wrong. It always felt like we were about to lose control and crash, like something out there was watching us and wanted us to crash. The canyon that had tons and tons of accidents. The highway patrol always said it was black ice or deer or the angle of the sun, people driving too fast, and the road is banked the wrong way on the turns. But still, there were so many accidents on that road. It just didn't feel safe no matter the season or time of day. Yeah, that canyon that's littered with failed businesses and abandoned farms because people got sick or had a run of bad luck that didn't end until they finally gave up and went back to the valley. We always go around that stretch of mountains, out across the marshes and through the low saddle where the river is. It is longer, but that highway has fewer lanes and a lower speed limit, and late at night there are beaver and otter and deer to look out for. And 3 seasons out of 4 it has a fog as thick as pea soup. But the back way doesn't have whatever. And I know, whatever it was headed towards that canyon. Patrick by the Why Not Guy. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm wrong about so many other things. I could be wrong about this as well. My story is 100% true, and make of it what you will. My second semester at Syracuse University, I met a guy named Patrick. We sat next to each other in Spanish class, and though I wouldn't say we were friends exactly, we talked before and after class. Patrick was in a wheelchair. He'd been paralyzed in a rowing accident his junior year of high school. He seemed to have a great attitude about his disability, but as the semester progressed and I got to know him better, I realized that it was all a front. Patrick was actually depressed and quite bitter about his situation. I can't say I'd have done better in his place. After our semester together ended, I used to see Patrick around campus. He was easy to spot from a distance, and we'd always wave or call out a quick greeting. I had a vague plan to visit him one day and really catch up, but I never did. Then I read in the campus newspaper that Patrick had fallen out of the window of his high-rise dorm room and died. He was doing mushrooms when it happened, and he was alone. As I read the story, I just assumed that he'd killed himself. I had no evidence or inside knowledge. I liked him a lot, but again, we weren't close friends at all. But I was absolutely certain that that was no accident. Months passed, then years. I had failed out of Syracuse and was in my last year at UB, working at the campus magazine one winter morning. I left the production room at about 3:30 a.m. and started walking home. It was cold and clear, and a few inches of snow had fallen. There was no sound, the snow was soft, and my footsteps were silent. I rounded Hayes Hall, and as I did so, I suddenly had an unobstructed view of the lawn stretching down to Main Street about 100 yards away. I stopped in my tracks, only a few feet from O'Brien Hall, because down on the sidewalk along the street was a man in a wheelchair. And while I was too far away to see his face, his profile and bearing looked just like Patrick. I had barely completed that thought when whoever it was turned his chair around to face me and held up his hand in a silent wave. I looked at him for a few seconds, then ran back around the corner the way I'd come. I wasn't scared, but I was definitely freaked out, if that makes any sense. And being cold and tired, I probably wasn't thinking too clearly. I've thought a lot about this in the years since, and I'm convinced there's no way he could have heard me walking or seen me huddled in the shadow of a building at 3:30 a.m. from so far away. Yet he turned to me, the only other person in sight, and waved. I don't know if this is a ghost story or not, but it sure felt like one when it was happening. Inexplicable Occurrence in Red River Gorge, Kentucky, by Then Building 9493. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this incident and wanted to see if it resonates with anyone else. Me, a 28-year-old male, and my wife, a 28-year-old female, and a dog, male 3, recently went to Red River Gorge, a state park in southeast Kentucky. We're no strangers to camping in the park, and having been there at least 20 times over the past 8 years. We chose a spot I'd been to 2 to 3 times before, and it's worth noting that this site is outside of the other dispersed camping areas, and is essentially the only proper spot with car parking along a 2-mile stretch of road. There's a dilapidated barn about a mile up from where we drove in, and a cemetery about 1/3 of a mile in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it's a rarely traveled road, and we saw no one all day, just an occasional car, maybe 1 or 2 an hour. The spot is at the base of a 30-foot incline that a 4x4 could handle. Our SUV was parked horizontally at the top, blocking other vehicles from descending, and from there it's about 30 yards into the campground with another slope leading to the river's edge and swimming hole. The day went great. We spent time near the beach and letting our dogs swim, and then did typical camping activities like hiking, foraging, chopping wood, throwing the hatchet, and enjoying a few beers. Once sunlight began to fade around 6:30, we started a fire and began cooking dinner. As darkness fell and the last light disappeared, we heard the usual sounds, squirrels rustling, things falling into the leaves, which spooked my wife a bit, but we didn't think much of it. Then, at about 9 p.m., sitting around the healthy fire and listening to music, we heard heavy shuffling in the leaves, definitely something large or heavy. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the road, about halfway between us and our car. I stopped the music, and after about 10 seconds of dead silence, we heard the shuffling again. Before I could call out, we heard this strange and unnatural noise, something like a throttling, ascending pitch mixed with a shriek. Neither of us could verbally describe it, and I can confidently say I've never heard anything like it before. It was about 20 or 25 feet away, just outside the reach of my headlamp. Our dog went insane, hair standing on end, barking incessantly into the darkness. He was on a long lead, or I'm sure he would have taken off after it. My wife and I were frozen. I was holding my hatchet and trying to catch any movement or sound to track. After about 2 or 3 minutes of that, with no further noises, I calmed the dog and we grabbed some essentials and hurried to the car. Our adrenaline was pumping as we discussed coyotes, foxes, or other animals as the possible culprits. I didn't want to mention the possibility of people, as that would have heightened the paranoia. We eventually passed out after about an hour, but I spent the rest of the night in and out of a shallow sleep, feeling very uncomfortable both mentally and physically. I've always struggled to sleep anyway, except fully horizontal. At around 3 a.m., right next to my head, I heard a singular knock on my window, like someone tapped the glass with one knuckle. My wife didn't wake up, and I scanned the outside of the car but didn't see or hear anything. I struggled to doze off again, and my heartbeat was rapid. When we finally got the first light around 7 a.m., we cooked breakfast, packed up our campsite, and got the hell out of Dodge. No prints or anything out of sorts with our remaining belongings either. What's strange to me is that after hearing the noise, we heard no additional heavy shuffling from the source. With our dog barking so aggressively, we should have heard whatever it was moving away. We've looked up various animal noises native to the gorge, and nothing even remotely resembles what we heard. The knock on the window was also isolated. There were no other noises or visible happenings outside the car immediately following. Lastly, I had a thought the day after we left. I remember whistling for our dog after dark since we had some scraps to give him near the fire. Immediately I thought, shit, I shouldn't have whistled. But up until that trip, I'd never been a believer of any superstitions. I just like to respect the folklore that I've heard. In hindsight, we're now convinced I may have invited a Wendigo or a skinwalker to our camp. I won't take those superstitions lightly again, and I'm sure this occurrence will affect at least my next few overnights in those woods. Strange Experiences by Anonymous. When I was dating my now wife, we lived a couple of cities apart and would usually rotate weekends at each other's places. One particular Thursday night before the weekend, I was in my apartment lying in bed when I felt something on the other side of my king-sized bed. I brushed it off as being one of those moments when you're right on the cusp of falling asleep and your body has those involuntary reactions and you try to go back to sleep. But moments later, I felt it again, and this time being wide awake, I knew it was actually something, and not just my imagination. I got up, turned on the lights, and did a full sweep of my bedroom, and of course found nothing. Thinking that I was letting my mind get the best of me, I tried to fall back to sleep, when I felt it again, and this time I could see an indentation on the other side of the bed. I got up and went to my living room where I finally fell asleep with all the lights on. Slept on my couch. The next day, I didn't think too much of it and just told myself it was all in my head and moved on with my day. I didn't tell anyone. That night I went to my wife's apartment and stayed with her, and we had a pretty normal night. Saturday morning, we had to wake up early to go for a photo shoot she was doing, and I asked her how she slept. Her response was, I felt someone at the foot of the bed all night and couldn't sleep, so I stayed awake and prayed all night. That caught me off guard, and I told her about the experience I had the previous night. Later that day, I went back to my apartment and decided to take a nap, as it had been a long weekend at that point. When I woke up from my nap, all the lights in my apartment were on, and the water was running in the bathroom sink. My doors were still locked. It was a small one-bedroom apartment, and so I turned everything back off and just prayed. I'm not a hyper-religious man, but I wasn't sure what else to do at that point. After that weekend, not much else happened in either one of our apartments, and I'm not sure what would have caused such a random outburst of strangeness. I do have one other story from when I was a teenager. Before I could drive, my sister would have to drive me to and from wherever I needed to go. From our house to our school, there were two paths you could take. One was shorter but very bumpy with a lot of potholes. The other was longer but was paved better. There was about a 5-minute difference in time between the routes. We lived in a rural town and most everyone knew each other. Well, on the shortcut road that week, one of the older ladies had passed away and they had just had her funeral. That night my sister had to pick me up from basketball practice and we decided to take the shortcut home. It had just rained and there was steam and fog coming up from the ground, but nothing incredibly different than normal. As we were driving home, when we were passing in front of the lady's house that had died, there was a very clear shape of a human body in the fog, and it just went straight up, right in front of us. My sister hit the brakes and we looked at each other and then started to freak out. Of course, our parents didn't believe us, but 30 years later, we both still stick by our story. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel of the podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you could take a moment and like this video, that would be awesome. Maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Share it with your friends and leave a comment in the comments section. I would love to know what you think of the stories. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Find me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider purchasing some Campfire Crew and Uncle Josh merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is down there too. Everybody, I apologize for the second Halloween episode of 2024. It wasn't until after I'd finished recording that I realized I was talking into an unplugged Shure SM7B. Thing wasn't even on. I'm glad it's still recorded, and I'm sorry the sound was not up to normal, but hey, it was still a lot of fun to record, and I hope you enjoyed it. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.